Okay, everybody, I think we'll go ahead and get started with the meeting. My name is Aaron Egbert. I work for the City of Colorado Springs, and I'm the project manager for the brownfield grant. I want to thank you for participating tonight. We've got a lot of good information. We're excited to present it to you and show you some other things at the end that the city's doing as far as future brownfield grants. Go to the next slide. This is the agenda that we've got tonight. We've put it into two parts. We've got a welcome and introductions, project background. Brownfield 101 really is just an education of what a brownfield is, kind of education about our grant. And then we'll do an overview. We'll pause in the middle for some more questions for a Q&A, and Shauna will kind of outline you how we're going to do that a little bit later. And then part two is we'll jump into where we're at on this specific grant and our next steps. Go to the next slide. Thank you. So once again, my name is Aaron Egbert, senior engineer for the City of Colorado Springs, and I'm the project manager. We have Shauna Lippert, who's in our economic development group, Steve Posey, who manages our community development group and is also working to kind of stand up our brownfield program for the city. We'll have Kimberly Bailey from the City of Fountain, who's one of our coalition partners. And then the glue that keeps us all together is Carrie Radke with Stantec, keeping us all going in the right direction. So this is just so I'll turn this over to Shauna so she can kind of walk you through a little bit of how we're going to do this and how you can ask your questions.
All right, thank you, Aaron. So welcome everyone to the Brownfields public meeting. It's so good to have such a good group here tonight. So how this will work is, as Aaron mentioned, we will have a two-part presentation. The first presentation, part one, will be about 20 to 25 minutes. And what we will be monitoring as the presentation is going is questions that are submitted throughout. So we will be monitoring that. We will take a break for questions to see what has been asked so far. We'll try to answer those as best we can in the time we have during the break. And then we will start with our presentation part two, which will be another 20-25 minutes. We will have a 10-minute Q&A at the end. And as the slide shows, there's an area where it says click here to type a question into the Q&A box. So as you think of questions, or if you have a question right now that you would like answered, please click that little two-part dialog box to type your question into the box. We will not have an option for people to verbally state their question, so it needs to be typed into the Q&A box, and we will either answer your question during the break or at the 10 minutes at the end. All right, so now what I'll be doing is handing it back to Aaron for the beginning of brownfields and the topic for tonight. Aaron?
Thank you, Shauna. Why might you be interested in what a brownfield is? As far as the City of Colorado Springs goes, the Shooks Run corridor is our main focus, which, as many of you may know, is the Legacy Loop connection. It's General Palmer's vision for a trail loop around the downtown core. Maybe you're a landowner with some environmental issues or concerns about the future uses of your site, then what could be the highest and best use for it? Is a property underutilized, needing revitalization? And if you want to buy a property that may have some concerns, we can do the phase one and some environmental work for you to kind of help that process. Next slide. So we'll kick into the kind of the project background and brownfields. Go right ahead. I could probably talk about this for a half hour, but I will give you the briefest section of this. Back in 2015, with the renewal of the Pikes Peak Regional Rural Transportation Authority, one of the A-listed projects was a bridge study for the Shooks Run corridor. It's a 4-mile corridor from Fountain Creek up to the other side of Patty Jewett Golf Course. With that project, we created a facilities master plan that outlined the different uses or the repurposing and the revitalization of the entire 4-mile corridor with different sections. And I'd encourage you to go to that website, envisionshooksrun.com, to look at some of that detail. But once we completed the master plan, we completed the sustainable infrastructure plan, which is kind of the city's template on what the scope of the project, how to divide it up between multiple departments. We really didn't know how to implement or fund these changes. So we hired Stantec to kind of come up with a funding strategy for us. And the real low-hanging fruit was this EPA brownfield. The city had never applied for this grant before. So we applied for that. We were awarded it really almost like 3 years ago to the date, I believe. And what we did with that to make a stronger case for us is we partnered with coalition partners. So it was Colorado Springs Utilities, School District 11, and the City of Fountain are the 4 coalitions. And with that, I will turn it over to Carrie to get into the nuts and bolts.
Thanks, Aaron. I assume I'm on camera. So yeah, thanks for introducing me. I back in the fall of 2018, I helped the city write a brownfield grant application for $600,000, and we're going to get into some detail about what the EPA brownfield grant program is and what kind of grants are available. But just to kind of continue on Aaron's timeline of sort of how we got to the point of the city having these funds, we wrote the grant in 2018, and it had 2 focus areas. As Aaron described, in Colorado Springs, the focus area is the Shooks Run Creek corridor, based on the plans for Envision Shooks Run and the Legacy Loop, completing the Legacy Loop. And we really are focusing specifically within that area, heavily in the confluence where Shooks Run enters Fountain Creek. And then it made a lot of sense talking with Fountain, since Fountain Creek continues on down south into Fountain, to ask them what their priority areas were and what they might want to focus on. And they have some urban renewal areas. They have their Old Town Gateway District, and they have an area called Fountain Creek Bank that they had identified some sites that were underutilized and could benefit from the type of work that this grant funds. So those were the focus areas we highlighted within the grant, and now we're highlighting and kind of keeping the focus there now that the cities are implementing the grant work. So success, we submitted the grant. It was chosen by EPA for funding, and that funding was awarded in the fall of 2019, all $600,000, which is the maximum that the city could apply for at that time. It's a 3-year grant term. Extensions are possible, and they're actually quite common because it's a lot of work to do in a 3-year period. But the official sort of first hot deadline for us is the EPA's fiscal year starts October 1, 2022. So that is the deadline right now for the grant to be wrapped up or to request an extension if needed. So that's kind of an overview of how the city came to build this coalition and decide to apply for a brownfield grant. But kind of taking a step back, I think it's really helpful and important to talk about what really is a brownfield. EPA publishes this definition: property where expansion, redevelopment, or reuse is complicated by the presence or suspected presence of contamination. And that can actually, in real life, what that can look like is very different from site to site. So it's not necessarily a big old abandoned factory or mill or gas station. It can look like a lot of different things. So, what do we look for when we're saying, is this site a brownfield? Is it appropriate to kind of dedicate brownfield revitalization funding here? Past and current use of the site can be an indication of whether there could be some challenges to redeveloping that property. Dry cleaners and gas stations are the properties that probably come to people's minds the fastest because of the storage and the use of chemicals and petroleum at these sites. So that's something that can indicate potential brownfield conditions. It could be something like this lower picture here where there's just kind of visual signs that something has been going on there. You know, there's been material storage or distribution or potential releases. It could be much less obvious. It could just be an opportunity for infill development. You know, EPA repeatedly talks about how these brownfield grants, you know, they're about contamination to some extent, but they're also about smart growth and smart planning and smart land use. So if there's an opportunity for infill development on a site like this, can these brownfield grants help you know, ease a developer or a purchaser's mind about what's gone on there in the past, what the condition of the property is, and put something there rather than put it out beyond where infrastructure and people already are, preventing sprawl. Another kind of thing that indicates potential for brownfield conditions is something is just not the best use for its location. This is kind of an obvious example here is a downtown with a big old factory that's kind of still there. This has probably been revitalized into something fantastic, but it gives you the visual of, you know, is there something in the downtown or in a neighborhood that doesn't fit with the neighborhood's goals or the zoning or just the best use of that property? Could be as simple as vacant property. You know, you can see this kind of corridor here where it's pretty apparent that it has been developed in the past, but you can't really get a feel for what was there and why things are not there now. Are people avoiding this property because they know something about it? These brownfield grant funds can sort of be dedicated to helping kind of figure out what's going on a vacant lot so that, again, it's kind of infill development. Preventing sprawl and doing land recycling. Underutilization is a term we use a lot. And essentially, you know, I always think of tiny building with very few jobs on a big property. You know, that's a good example of underutilization. And this picture just kind of shows, it doesn't look like this parking lot is in very high demand. It's a big piece of property. It's paved. There's stormwater runoff, you know, happening at this property, and there's a business there, but it's small and it's not maybe, you know, there's opportunities to fill in here, to expand. So that's kind of a classic example of underutilization. You know, could this property be expanded to create more jobs, to improve the tax rolls? There's just more that it could be accomplishing for the community. So EPA, you know, was aware of these challenges, was watching kind of as industrial sites closed down. They were just sitting there. Nobody was taking the sort of the risk on of redeveloping these properties without understanding what those risks are, what they look like. So in the 90s, EPA came up, you know, kind of developed their EPA Brownfield Grant Program. And really what it is it's funding and technical assistance. It's not, you know, an enforcement program, and it's not a program where they're trying to kind of find people to come after for fines. It's grants and technical assistance largely. So every year they accept grant applications for grants for assessments, which is testing and research, for cleanup, and for a few other things, planning related to revitalize brownfields. And it has historically been a very, you know, bipartisan supported program because it's very much just as much about economic development as it is about environmental improvement and enhancement. So that's, you know, helped it to be such a long-lived program. And it has historically, it's gotten over time been a very competitive grant program. We're hearing with some of the infrastructure funding that has come out recently that the EPA Brownfield program is getting a significant infusion. So maybe it will become less competitive and more communities can benefit from this funding. But historically, it has been a very competitive program. Colorado too, at the state level, has a brownfield program, and most states do. They kind of vary from state to state and how complex they are and what kind of offerings they have. But in Colorado, there's always technical assistance available from the brownfield experts at the Department of Public Health and Environment. And they have cleanup grant funding available. It's not a big pot of money, but they do have some cleanup funding available. They have a revolving loan fund specifically for brownfields so that they can make friendly term loans for cleanup of brownfields to bring them back into productive use. And they offer a remediation tax credit. So if a developer is looking to, develop a property, but there's a contamination issue that has to be dealt with first, there's a tax incentive there for private developers. So that's kind of a programmatic background, how the regulators decided that this program was needed and how they kind of got it started. So what are sort of some of the goals of brownfield revitalization? These bullet points, they're not only goals, I think, of brownfield revitalization, they can also be kind of like I gave you the laundry list of what a brownfield might be. But these are, if you see a site where redevelopment there might prevent sprawl, maybe that's a brownfield. If it might deter crime and dumping and vandalism, if you can redevelop it, get more use, the more eyes and more activity you have on a property, the less likely it is there will be crime and dumping and vandalism. It helps create jobs. It improves the tax base and property values. Of course, it protects public and environmental health if you can alleviate, or mitigate the risk from contaminants that are left on a site. And it, of course, enhances livability for the community. So these are all things that EPA and the city are have in mind when they're working through using these funds. Another goal of the EPA's grant program is to leverage additional funding. I mean, maybe when you hear us say, $600,000, for a brownfield redevelopment, that doesn't sound like a whole lot of money, and it isn't really, but what it's supposed to be is seed money or leveraging funding. So, the EPA studies this, and they found that for every $1 they've invested in the brownfield program, nearly $18 of total investment has been leveraged. So, if EPA can say, we can help you with a $50,000 environmental assessment, private developer or city who wants to develop a park, what other funding sources can you bring to the table? And it's been very successful. Speaking of successful, there's a couple of brownfield success stories to share here. So this is a project in Leadville, Colorado. I think everybody is kind of familiar with the mining and smelting history in Leadville. So they had a lot of legacy environmental issues from that industry, and they had an EPA brownfield grant. And one of the projects that came out of that is this Cloud City Conservation Center, which is, a kind of a grassroots organization, nonprofit that focuses on sustainability and recycling and farming and community education and programs. I've put their website there on the slide if you're interested in checking out kind of more detail about what they do, but it's a pretty dramatic before and after. So that's an exciting kind of Colorado-based brownfield success story. Another one is down in Trinidad. There was a rail yard right at the kind of the entrance to downtown, right off the highway. And you can see in the upper left, the buildings had been, closed down for years and years. And there had been quite a bit of bulk storage of petroleum and that kind of thing. So there was some contamination out there. And the city of Trinidad has this exact same grant that the city of Colorado Springs has. And they were able to use that funding to do some environmental assessment at the property and help a developer turn it into this area that they're calling La Puerta, so the gateway into Trinidad. And there's a restaurant there now. They broke ground on a Hilton Garden Inn. There's a welcome center that's planned in the old train depot. So, you know, it's exciting to see what can happen to some of these former industrial sites when these brownfield grants and you know, supplemental funding are involved. So I'll pause there and kind of hand things back to Shauna to tell us if there are some questions we can answer at this point.
Thank you, Carrie. I appreciate that. So good information so far of how we got here and about the brownfield. So in reminder, if you have any questions, please click as it's shown on the slide, the little 2-part dialog box to click here that says click here to type a question into the Q&A box. A couple of questions that we have that have come in the last couple of minutes. Mark is asking, will these slides be made available? So Mark, we will have these slides and this presentation available on our project website, which the link is posted earlier in the chat box, and you will be able to view the actual recording of this. I will ask Carrie if Carrie, do we normally hand out the slides themselves, or is it only the video?
I don't think we have posted the slides in the past, but I think it's totally fine to do that. So if that makes sense for you, we can totally post those slides.
Okay, so good question, Mark. Thank you so much. And we will definitely be posting the video with the Q&A, and we will work on the slide piece. Aaron, do you have any input on slides?
No, I'm perfectly okay putting the slides on the website. If you go to colorsprings.gov, and then search for EPA, you'll be able to find our project website, but we'll post them there for you, along with the recorded video.
Okay, thank you, Aaron. All right, our next question. Does the city envision applying for subsequent EPA brownfield grants in the future? So Aaron, this might be a question for you as well.
Yes, so we have, in order to apply for another grant, we will need to be 70% spent on the existing grant we have, and we're working hard to do that. We don't think we'll have a problem. They've got a lot more funding now in the EPA program with some of the infrastructure bills. So yes, so the city is definitely chasing that, and we're excited about additional opportunities, maybe more citywide, not as focused on the Shooks Run corridor. And then at the end, we'll also, Steve Posey will talk a little bit about us standing up a more staffed program with some dedicated staff time.
All right, thank you, Aaron. All right, so it looks like those are our first 2 questions that we have in the chat box, and I think if there are no other ones that come in, we can move on to the second portion of our presentation. And again, we will have a Q&A segment at the end of this presentation. So as you think of questions, please put them in the chat box and we will get to those towards the end. So coming back into the next segment for our next slide.
Shauna, there was one more question I just published there for you to look at, the Q&A.
Oh, there is. Thank you. All right, thank you, Max. Okay, one more question. Aaron is asking, can you share some specific challenges and or opportunities implementing the EPA grant along Shooks Run? Aaron, do you want to start off with this one?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. I think the biggest challenge that I found is we didn't have a lot of properties along Shooks Run lined up for this grant. So we really needed to spend a lot more time doing kind of due diligence with developers and adjacent property owners to the creek. And I think we could have been a little bit more successful if we would have advertised it and got more people on board before we actually received the grant and started reaching out to the neighborhood and the businesses along the corridor. And that's the one thing that I think if we do have a more dedicated staff and more of a program, we'll just be able to have those relationships ahead of applying for the grant, and that'll just make it easier to implement.
All right, thank you, Aaron. Any other questions that anyone has before we move on to part 2 of the presentation? All right, so we will turn this over to part 2. This is where we're going to get into the project update portion. And so we have Carrie teed up for the project update to begin this section. Carrie?
Great. Thanks, Shauna. All right. So what do EPA brownfield grants actually pay for? This is kind of the menu of things that EPA brownfield grants typically cover. So they cover phase 1 and 2 environmental site assessments. So a phase 1 environmental site assessment involves research into the history of the use of a property and its current use to get an idea if there were potentially contaminating uses that that might represent barriers to getting that property redeveloped efficiently and without any roadblocks. So at a phase 1, there, it's research, it's looking at historical aerial photos and maps and records and, regulatory environmental records to see if there are known instances of releases. So we call it a desktop study. There's no sampling involved in a phase 1. And a lot of times phase 1s are a critical part of dealing with lenders, and they happen during property transactions. A lot of lenders will require that a purchaser that they're lending to conduct a phase 1, and it's a very prescriptive process. So there's specific questions and things you have to look into to do a phase 1 in accordance with the industry standard. And a lot of banks will require that happens. So the ability to help property purchasers with that cost can help unlock move properties forward in their potential for redevelopment. Phase 2 environmental site assessments, that's where you collect samples. So if a phase 1 is done, or it doesn't have to necessarily be a phase 1 done first, but if you have an idea of what's happened on a property, you can develop a sampling plan and collect soil, groundwater, soil gas samples and evaluate those in terms of your planned use of a property, so that the grant can pay for those phase 2 sampling environmental site assessments. It can pay for building materials surveys. So if a building is, underutilized or vacant and someone's interested in redeveloping it, adaptive reuse or renovation, but there are unknowns about asbestos and lead paint, the grant can pay for that sampling. So it can pay for asbestos surveys and lead paint surveys, and it can pay for planning for abatement, abating those the asbestos and lead paint. And it can pay for planning for cleanup and reuse, but it can't actually pay for the cleanup itself. There are other funding sources for that. This is the type of grant that the city has, is an assessment grant. So that's where kind of that funding stops. But you can plan for cleanup. You can prepare remediation plans that say, in order to get this site ready for your planned use, you need to do X, Y, and Z. Here's a cost estimate, or here's an RFP where you can go out to bidders and get cost estimates on what this soil removal or this remedial action is going to cost. You can also, that's the kind of the cleanup planning if there's remediation, if there's contamination that needs to be dealt with. But then there's also reuse planning, and reuse planning is a very broad category. So if, kind of whatever planning related roadblock you might be coming up against, do you need a conceptual design done because you know you want X use on a site, but you're not sure, you know, exactly how that would look. How will traffic circulate? What would parking look like? Where will homes be? Where will buildings be? The grant can pay for that kind of planning. It can pay for community engagement to talk to the community about use on a particular piece of property and say, you know, does this meet your needs? Is this something that you want in your neighborhood? It can pay for, you know, infrastructure studies. If I had a project where the water lines in this small city were old and they were very small and they were not up to code for building new development. So you couldn't put sort of new, you know, light manufacturing in this business area because you couldn't meet the fire code. There wasn't enough water to, you know, have the sprinklers function properly. So that kind of study, those kinds of reuse plans can potentially be paid for with this grant. So that's a very useful and flexible way to spend some of this funding. What has happened so far with this particular grant? So year one, the first year of these grants, there's a lot of projects set up. You have to do a lot of work plans and kind of technical pieces that have to be in place and approved by EPA, and you're kind of getting your plan in place and approved. And we started with some outreach planning. So we had a public meeting, and we've kind of reached out to stakeholders in the community, nonprofits, and people who are, you know, connected to a lot of different sectors of the community to try and publicize. We built the website to make this, you know, to share information about the grant. And then year two is when we really were able to start getting into the phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments. So in year two, we did five phase 1 ESAs. We completed, started and finished 3 phase 2 ESAs, and we started several more that are, you know, we're still kind of underway as we moved into year 3. And then we continued the outreach, another public meeting, and looking for opportunities to kind of push the word out into the community, having meetings with people, and adding content to the website. And now we're in year 3, just kind of, it feels like we're just getting started, but here we are at the end of the first quarter of year 3. We've got 7 phase 2 environmental site assessments that are either completed or underway. And we're working on, and we've continued outreach, of course, here we are. And we've started cleanup and reuse planning, predominantly reuse planning, at 4 sites in both Colorado Springs and Fountain. So that's underway right now, and part of, you know, what we're doing even this week, which I will kind of get to when we talk about kind of spotlighting some projects. So just to give you kind of a view of where in Colorado Springs the sites are where some of the funding has been used. You know, here is the Shooks Run corridor, the creek, and here's the confluence with Fountain Creek. And so we've done a great job of staying really close to this core, this corridor, and helping move, you know, these properties back into productive use and really stay focused in this area. In Fountain, we've kind of moved, you know, down these high visibility intersections where there's opportunity to do some residential and industrial and commercial development to, you know, enhance economic development, and then a few right down here in the core of Fountain. And I'll talk about one of those when I spotlight a couple of projects here. So speaking of project spotlights, I'm going to turn this particular project over to Erin to just give a little bit of a context for what happened at the Castilla Bridge.
Thanks, Carrie. Yeah, this is a unique use of funds. This is Burlington Northern's spur. It used to be the line that went up to the old depot, which is now the Catalyst campus, adjacent to Pikes Peak, kind of where Pikes Peak and Colorado split. And the city was able to request the retirement of the tracks north of Castilla. And this bridge was built in the early 1900s. And by retiring those tracks, that allowed the Catalyst campus to purchase this sliver of property from their southern boundary all the way down to Castilla. And with that land, they also were able to acquire this bridge, which has very difficult underclearance issues. There's a lot of safety issues with a lot of moisture leaking through the bridge deck, onto ice, onto the sidewalks, those type of things. So the grant was able to do this assessment on what we need to do to remove it and how to abate any hazardous materials there. So this is an exciting way that the grant was able to help us with our infrastructure. The Envision Shooks Run master plan showed that Castilla needed to be raised at this location. So the removal of this bridge is critical to implementing any of the Shooks Run improvements and potentially the redevelopment of the transit mix site, which is a very high priority for the city of Colorado Springs.
Thanks, Aaron. Another site that a lot of people have been interested in and that we talked about specifically in the grant application because of its history and its current ownership and some exciting things going on there is the site that's known as Concrete Coyote, that is owned by the nonprofit Concrete Couch. It's this wedge-shaped kind of property that I've highlighted in yellow. So we're actually going to do a little planning, a reuse planning event tomorrow with some nonprofit partners of Concrete Couch who each of the nonprofit partners kind of has a specialty. Some are in community gardening, mountain biking. So their focus for this planning event tomorrow is to really come together and talk about how this site can be developed in ways that enhance its ability to serve the neighborhood. What amenities can go on this site. They've already started doing some really fun things. They have a little theater space and they have a little soccer field, and they're doing some natural resource enhancement and restoration work there along the creeks. And so the grant funding is gonna help them come together to brainstorm ideas and put together a written plan that says, these are the things that are feasible given, zoning and landforms and flooding and the railroad and whatever constraints there are to developing on this site. And here are things the community wants and has said that they want on this property, and will make it really welcoming, a welcoming, safe place for the community. So we're really excited to work on that with them. And I'm not sure if Kimberly Bailey was able to join us quite yet. She had another meeting that she wasn't sure that this was going to overlap. Do you know, Shauna?
Carrie, she said that she is just wrapping up. I think if she does not have her camera on, she may not be able to be here yet to talk about this project.
Okay. Well, I will go ahead and just summarize on her behalf, and I'm sure she would be happy if folks want to reach out to her separately and get a more informed story about the site. But I do know quite a bit about the site. So this site's called Woodman Hall in downtown Fountain. It's a building that was built in 1905. It had a lot of uses historically, a lot of various uses, and it's now owned by the Urban Renewal Agency, the Fountain Urban Renewal Agency. And so they used grant funding to do asbestos and lead paint surveys completed those last year. Both asbestos and lead paint have been detected, so that allows them to hand that report to their construction contractor and say, this is what was found. This is exactly where these items were found. So when you go in to do your renovations to make this historic building, you know, do adaptive reuse and make it usable again, here's where you need to mitigate and remove the asbestos and lead paint. And the project is moving forward. A construction firm was awarded the work to be the general contractor in just this year, and to help steward FURA's vision. And this is, if you put a space between FURA and HTTP, that's the website if you'd like to go and check out some more detail about this project. But there's going to be mixed commercial on the ground floor and residential on the upper floor, which is historically how this building has been used, but needs a lot of updating and obviously abatement to make it safe for continued use. So that's an exciting one to keep an eye on. So this round of funding, as Aaron had mentioned earlier, is largely committed. The city's done a really good job of reaching out to, you know, property owners and potential property owners and developers, and you know, getting this grant out into the community. So there is some funding left, but it's dwindling. So I will turn it over to you, Steve, if you would like to just say a few words about what the city is planning in terms of carrying on the brownfield program.
Let's see there. Let me see if I can, did my camera come on? Yes, good evening, everybody. And happy to be here this evening and just speak for a few minutes about the city's plans to establish a more formal brownfields program. I think, you know, based on the two presentations, there are a couple things I wanted to point out. One of the things you've heard about and that I think, you know, is a topic of a lot of conversation these days is how downtown is changing. I mean, Aaron spoke specifically about the Castilla Bridge project and how, you know, that used to be a railroad spur that traveled from that main line, the Union Pacific and Burlington Northern Main Line up north to a train depot there that was located near Pikes Peak Avenue. And in the, you know, more recently that train depot has become a campus for business incubation and innovation. And there are plans for additional development along that railroad spur that would complement that campus with some residential uses and some more commercial uses. And then if you keep kind of coming down the creek there, you know, we also heard a little bit about the concrete couch property. That's another one that, you know, at one time was a landfill and is now being revitalized by a nonprofit that is turning that into a, you know, a terrific public amenity in the sense that you've got kids who can go there and participate in all sorts of creative activities. And then ultimately, part of the vision for that area is to be able to finish a trail system called the Legacy Loop, which would actually allow for, I mean, just a stunning bicycle and hiking trail that would come down along Shook's Run and go through that concrete Coyote property and then ultimately connect all the way down to Monument Creek. If you were to keep coming kind of back upstream, we're also looking at, you know, what are the possibilities for further developing America the Beautiful Park. You know, we've got this brand new world-class Olympic and Paralympic museum that was recently completed there with a pedestrian bridge that goes from that museum over to America the Beautiful Park. So those are just three examples of projects that are visible to us. We can see them now, and the ways that they are transforming the downtown area. And they've all got a couple of things in common, and one of them, of course, is a legacy of industrial use. These are sites that at one time or another were connected to the railroad, or they were connected to concrete plants or a landfill of some type. And now they're getting a whole new life here in the 2020s that is being made possible, at least in part by taking a close look at these sites, seeing what kind of cleanup needs to happen connected to them, and how they can be repurposed to fit into a bigger vision of the exciting and dynamic place that I think we all want downtown Colorado Springs to become. And in order to do that, we really do need to, at this point, the time has arrived for us to be a little bit more focused on establishing a brownfields grant program. I think a couple of people, Stacy and Aaron also, or I'm sorry, Carrie and Aaron also mentioned, the EPA has a tremendous amount of funding that has been made available over the last year or so through the American Rescue Plan. And the city, of Colorado Springs really wants to position itself to be able to take advantage of that funding, to be a good candidate for that funding, and to have a program internally set up at the city that will help us be a really good applicant for those grant funds. Because, in order to keep this going, in order to keep the process of transforming some of these older industrial properties into, public spaces and residential places and new commercial type of developments, these EPA grants are critical to helping make that happen. So we are very focused at this point on identifying, what is it going to take for the city to stand up a more formal brownfields program, and as we go forward, be in a position where we can really take advantage and make the best use of funding that's going to be available to the city here in the next several years. And I think, other than that, I'm happy to try to answer any questions that anybody might have. But otherwise, I'll turn it back over to Carrie, to you and Aaron.
Fantastic. Thank you, Steve. That was it in a nutshell. So we'll have some time for questions in just a sec. I thought I would quickly talk about the, this is a little snapshot of the web page on the city's website. So as Aaron said, it's just coloradosprings.gov/brownfields. And you can go there to sign up to receive project updates, get on a distribution list for mailing about events like this one or project updates. I wanted to mention too some of the other outreach that we've done that we didn't highlight so specifically. We have been reaching out to community organizations. There is a Brownfield Advisory Committee set up for this project that has, community members and elected officials and, other sort of city employees and stakeholders, and they helped to brainstorm a list of nonprofit organizations and community organizations, neighborhood groups, and we've been, making a concerted effort to get the word to those organizations. So, please, if you want more information or if you have an organization you think needs to, have someone give them a call or do a presentation, happy to do that. So this is kind of a general how to get more information on the project and how to stay informed. So you can get on the project update mailing list. You can reach out to Aaron at the City of Colorado Springs or Kimberly at City of Fountain. You can also, as we mentioned, the funding is going fast, but there's also this goal of having a continuous brownfield program at the city. And so they'd like to keep building an inventory of properties and property owners who are interested in participating and benefiting from this program. So they would like, they've been accepting nominations and they'd like to continue accepting nominations so that they, understand the demand for the program. And then when they tell EPA, when they apply and say, we want more funding, we have this list of properties that that the community knows could be doing more. So this is how to nominate a site, where I've circled at the bottom here. You can click on that button that says site nomination form, and a form will open up that you can complete with as much information as you have about the property. It doesn't have to be a property that you own. It doesn't have to be a property even within these focus areas that we've talked about, because, as I said, the city wants to know what kind of demand is out there and to share that with EPA through the application. So, if you are aware of a site, you drive by a site on the way to work every day and you wonder, why has that been vacant for so long? Let the city know about it. You can fill out one of these forms. If you'd rather, give Erin or Kimberly a call or send an email, that's fine too. But this is a good way to kind of let them know where it is, what the situation is with it, and get them educated about it before you have a conversation. And so what happens after you nominate a site, you submit one of those forms, the coalition will reach out to the site owner. They'll come together and make sure that the site meets the goals and the spirit of the brownfield program, and then they'll reach out to the property, or they'll talk to you about it, and then reach out to the property owner to gauge interest in getting involved. And then they'll talk with the stakeholders and the owner about what the grant can do, what might be needed at the property. So that's kind of the general process. Submit a form. If it's a nomination form saying I own or want to buy X property, they'll reach out to you and start fleshing that out and see if we can start moving through the process. But if it's just a, hey, keep this one on your radar, I'm concerned about it, or I have an idea in my mind that this could be something more, let them know. And this is just kind of a full shot of the cover of their web page, the Brownfields web page on the city website. And it's got a few tabs. So on this, the 3 tabs up at the top there that say program overview, program background and guiding principles, and grant program materials. Grant program materials is where you can go to see past public outreach meeting recordings and get fact sheets and that kind of thing, if you are interested. So with that, I will turn it back over to Shauna to see if we have some questions to answer. We're pretty close to time. We've got about 4 minutes, and maybe we can follow up with maybe an FAQ document if there are things that we can't get to tonight.
All right, thank you so much, Carrie. So as Carrie mentioned, we have about 4 minutes, so we'll try to get through questions as quickly as we can. We do have a question that is a very specific project question, and this possibly might be for Erin, about is there a timeline for the removal of the Castilla Bridge? Erin, do you have thoughts on that?
Yes, so the analysis and assessment has been completed for the environmental issues. We're still in the process of evaluating that. The next step is to acquire ownership from the Catalyst campus. So we need to transfer it to a city ownership. I also need to do a little bit of a historical evaluation to kind of document and understand the history of the structure. We're also going to work with Catalyst campus to see if they can salvage some of the steel pieces or the members and reuse them on their campus as a pavilion or some sort of an element that would help them with their site and those type of things. We would be demoing it with using some bridge maintenance funds once it's in our ownership, And my guess would be it should be demoed within a year. So that's kind of a long answer for a short, but I would anticipate this time next year that structure would be removed.
Okay, thank you, Aaron. Next question, and this might be a Carrie question, about a little bit about the specifics of the EPA grants. Are the EPA grants for remediation and or reuse as competitive as brownfields grants? Carrie, do you have any experience or thoughts on this?
Yes. So historically, the EPA cleanup grants have not been quite as competitive as assessment grants, but they're still competitive. They're still, yeah, you have to score pretty high in their sort of scoring rubric, but assessment grants have typically been the place where it has gotten very, very tough. And there used to be something called an area-wide planning grant. That has kind of gone away. That was exclusively for planning. And that has kind of been absorbed into the assessment grant because, as I described, you can do reuse planning with the assessment grants. So yeah, those particular grants have gone away. But historically, the assessment grants have been the most competitive, cleanup grants slightly less so. But now, as we've talked about with the bipartisan infrastructure law and all the funding, significant amount of funding coming into EPA, I think the competitiveness of all those types of grants is going to come down. And I think, you know, EPA has said they'll be able to fund a lot more grants now than they have in the past.
Okay, thank you, Carrie. I think we've got time for possibly one more question. We've got about 1 minute left. So this might be a combo question for Carrie and Aaron. Can you share the analysis criteria when you are evaluating a nomination?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and take that one. It's not a very formalized. It is very formalized, but we use our coalition members, which is utilities, District 11, Fountain, and Colorado Springs. So we screen all of the nomination forms, and then we have a citizen advisory committee that we go to on a quarterly basis and bounce some of these ideas off them to make sure it still fits with the intent of the overall grant. And then we'll reach back out to the property owner. So it's just sort of an internal project team as well as a citizen advisory committee that helps us deciding whether we should move forward with a site or not.
All right, great, Aaron. Thank you so much. So we're right at 7 o'clock. We're about ready to wrap up this meeting. So I would like to thank everyone for attending tonight's Brownfields public meeting. If you have any questions or something that did not get answered, we, as Carrie mentioned, we will be able to answer some questions offline if you just email them on the project page. And that link has been posted, I believe, 2 times in the chat. So please make note of that and bookmark that link. And so you can get regular updates. Please sign up for email updates. And we look forward to your input and also, again, possible nominations for potential brownfield sites in the future. So what I'll do is I'll turn it back over to Aaron for final comments, and we'll wrap up for tonight.
Thank you, Shauna. I just want to really just thank the community. Thank you for attending this. We will probably have maybe one more as we wrap up the project, but just thanks for your time. Thanks for your participation, your questions, and we look forward to implementing this project and hopefully many more with a brownfield program for the city of Colorado Springs. So thank you very much. Have a good night.